Good afternoon, everyone. Enjoy your lunch. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center and recovering politician. It is not a 12-step program. It actually, the more I read about Congress's performance in the newspaper, it's about a 4-step program. It's going faster. That's not what you came to hear today. But today's meeting is entitled Year of Decision, Obama, Netanyahu, and Competing Strategies to Deal with Iran. It's a very, very important topic, and we have a very important journalist to hear from today, my friend David Sanger of the New York Times. This event is part of the ongoing Non-Proliferation Forum series that the Center's International Security Studies program co-sponsors with Los Alamos National Laboratory. An additional co-sponsor of today's meeting is our Middle East program, ably directed by Haleh Esfandiari over there. Also like to welcome my personal special guest, Madame Sophie Delattre, who's wife of the French ambassador to the United States. Sophie and her husband, Francois, are good friends and brilliant emissaries for France in Washington. The Wilson Center values its partnership with Los Alamos, one of the country's preeminent science and technology institutions. Thanks to Director Charles McMillan for the lab's continuing support of our joint programming. On to today's issue. No challenge to international security is more pressing than Iran's nuclear program. Our conversation today occurs in the wake of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington and President Obama's speech to AIPAC, which contained a heavy focus on Iran. I was there, and I spoke on the opening panel at AIPAC before an audience of 13,000 people with Liz Cheney and an Israeli journalist. On that panel, I urged that Iran's nuclear program not become a partisan issue in these election wars in America in 2012. I said that partisanship will hurt our ally Israel, which properly perceives Iran as an existential threat, and it will also hurt us because what happens in Iran directly affects our security as well. Going forward, I think it is very important for discussions like this to help build consensus in our country about what our best policy is on Iran. I think we failed to do this at the time we went into Iraq, and we also failed to do it when we played the role we did in support of NATO in Libya. And should we be doing more on Iran, it is important to have the American people understand what that might be and what its implications are. On a related subject, yesterday on a BBC News program, I reiterated an idea that I proposed recently in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and that is to suggest that there may be an opportunity, I don't know if there's an opportunity, but I hope there is an opportunity, to find the way to offer personal immunity to the Bashar al-Assad family in Syria in exchange for, one, their rapid departure from the country, and two, the formation of a multi-ethnic government there that would, one, stop the massacres, but two, build stability in a country that has seen none in recent time. My model for this is Yemen, where we, the world community, were successful in getting the 40-year dictator and leader of the then massacre in Yemen out of the country, and we were successful in forming a sort of kind of unity government led by the then vice president, who has now been elected. I think that if we could accomplish something like that, this relates to Iran, we would close Iran's back door or front door to very dangerous terror groups considered its proxies, and to, through Syria, its efforts to destabilize Lebanon and to cause mischief in Israel. So I think it would be a very good thing if we could think about a changed and better strategy in Syria, well beyond the UN statement of a few days ago. And we might even hope that Russia could lead such a strategy. I think that would be a very good way for the new head of Russia to reset Russia policy. At any rate, this is a watershed year, and we will hear good ideas, I'm sure, on what we should do about Iran. A former U.S. senior official once quipped that problems have solutions, dilemmas have horns. To shed light on the Iranian nuclear dilemma, whether the horns can be straddled, we are fortunate to have with us today one of the country's most distinguished journalists, David Sanger, who is chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times. Earlier this week, I read in a paper, not the New York Times, about a journalist named David who was dubbed the national security go-to guy. Well, I'm here to tell you that there are at least two such Davids in this town, and one of them is sitting right here. During his nearly 3 decades at the Times, David has been a member of 2 teams that won the Pulitzer Prize and has received numerous awards for investigative national security and White House reporting. And it's a pleasure to welcome him back to the Wilson Center. He wrote his acclaimed 2009 book, The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Power, while in residence here as a public policy scholar. How many of you knew that? Well, that's not enough. That's really sad. He's now on another book leave from the Times, this time at USIP, our friendly competitor down the road in the fancy building, where he is completing a successor volume on the Obama administration's record in dealing with nonproliferation and other international security challenges. I'm sure he'll tell all, and he says I'm so jealous of the way he can do this. Stuff is coming back from the editor while he's doing his final drafting that I wish I could write a thoughtful, heavy-duty book. One of the quality of David's last books. With that, it is now my pleasure to turn to Joseph Polat of the Los Alamos, who, along with the center's own estimable Rob Litvak, co-chairs the Non-Proliferation Forum and will moderate today's discussion. Joe.
Thank you. Let me offer a welcome from Los Alamos and to some of my colleagues in Los Alamos who are being able to watch this on webcast. I, too, and Los Alamos values this relationship and hope it continues for a long time. I think that we've heard some concise and brilliant remarks that set this talk up. We've had the speaker introduced, so I think there's nothing more than to go immediately to David.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Jane, for that introduction and for the assumption, which I think she might have been leaping toward, that it actually is a wise thing to be dealing with pages coming back while you're still writing others. It's really not. But she made it sound good.
It's impressive.
It's great to be back here at Wilson. I actually finished my writing of The Inheritance right on this floor, right around the corner. And it's a wonderful place, and went to many great lunches here and had the benefit of being able to pop downstairs and have Rob read a chapter and say to him, does this make any sense? And he has a very gentle way of coming back and saying, no, actually it doesn't. It's a really incredible institution, and it's wonderful to see it in Jane's hands. I've discovered there are great places to talk on panels with Jane. The best is out near her place in Aspen, but this will take as a good second. She mentioned the AIPAC discussion, and if you haven't seen the video of Jane and Liz Cheney having this interesting debate before the president spoke, it's worth Googling. It was a really interesting conversation. I was in the back of the room that day. It was sort of it sort of took people who are really come at the issue from very different places, and it turned out to be a really productive conversation. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about where we are in the great standoff with Iran, because there are so many people in the room here who know so much more about the subject than I do, that I think it will probably be worthwhile at some point for me just to get the conversation rolling, get Rob engaged in a conversation we've been having about containment and Iran, and then open it up to all of you. But in brief summary, when President Obama first took office, you may recall that there had been a debate during the 2008 campaign about whether to engage with one's adversaries, and he took the position that he would engage without condition. He was told by a few people he was naive in doing that. Among those who told him that was the woman who would become his Secretary of State, who then had to go actually enforce the engagement that they were debating about. And they tried that for a while. They basically gave a year to engagement. It didn't last for terribly long, even through that year, because the president, you may recall, started with an open message to the Iranian people during the Iranian New Year. He wrote a series of secret letters to the supreme leader and also to President Ahmadinejad. He got back letters that, from the small parts that have been read to me, read a lot like sort of the public discourse back and forth on this. And then he had three other elements of his plan in backup, but which, if you go into WikiLeaks and look at some of the cables, you will discover really got ramped up almost as soon as the president came into office, in such a way that it was pretty clear that while they wanted to pursue engagement, I don't think that they had many illusions that engagement would yield very much at the beginning. And it didn't yield very much, in part because the June 12, 2009 elections came along, and that sort of froze everything after the crackdown on the Green Movement. So what were the three other elements that were underway? One of them was sanctions, and it took until the summer of 2010 to really get another UN resolution that had allowed a serious amount of additional leeway. And it's really only been in the past 4 or 5 months that we've begun to see sanctions that go right after the oil sector, and that's why this is becoming a more interesting moment. We'll come back and talk about sanctions in a moment. The second and third thing that he ordered up was a review of the covert plans against Iran. You've read about many of those. Israel has a covert program. The United States has a covert program. We've reported in the Times in January of 2011 that Stuxnet, which you read about, the computer worm, was a joint U.S.-Israeli project. And then on top of that, the president ordered a remaking of all of the American military plans because it was such a complex set of moving parts. And so John Allen, who is now the commander in Afghanistan, was put in charge of really assembling the hardening of sites throughout the Middle East, including many of the oil terminals and refining areas, putting in anti-missile batteries in many of the Gulf states that were willing to take them. Most of the Gulf states weren't willing to talk about it publicly. In one case that I'll describe in the forthcoming book, they actually put in a missile battery that didn't work, but they wanted to just have it in place so that the Iranians would think it was working. It now works. They then went through a number of different efforts to try to figure out whether or not they could have a very graduated approach to conflict if it broke out in the Gulf. And by graduated approach, I mean a conflict that could be as high level as an Israeli attack on the nuclear facilities, but also just as low level as the Iranians trying to either mine parts of the Strait, or the Iranians trying to do something else within the region that would harass shipping. And they tried to have a very graduated approach to all of that. They have not had to put any of that to the test yet, and so we don't know how any of that will work out. The hope was that in doing these many different layers, and by doing so much together with the Israelis, that they could forestall the debate that broke out in Israel anyway at the end of last year about whether Israel should take military action. Now, why that broke out and when it broke out is pretty fascinating and has to do with a lot of leaking, mostly to the Israeli press. But you suddenly began to hear a term that we had not heard before, which was a zone of immunity. This was a phrase that Ehud Barak had come up with. And the issue that Barak raised was whether or not Iran was about to enter, largely through its emplacements at GUM, the underground facility that President Obama had revealed in 2009, and that you'd read a little bit about elliptically in the opening pages of the book I worked on here, where we first described the suspicions that there were significant other enrichment sites. But the concern that the Israelis had by the end of last summer was that GUMS was beginning to be equipped with centrifuges, and that once it was fully operational, it was down so deep under so much granite that there was no way that the Israelis could take it out in a military strike. And that's what would create this zone of immunity, that the Iranians would have at that point as much time as they wanted to enrich for as long as they wanted. That the question of timelines, which we'd all been engaged in here around this table, would basically become no longer an issue that was terribly interesting. That the timelines themselves wouldn't make a difference if you had all the time in the world to get the enrichment done, particularly if the Iranian strategy was not to go over the line and actually build a weapon, but rather just walk right up to that line. In other words, warm the soup but not really cook it. And that looks so far to have been what the path the Iranians have taken. I needn't run through with all of you because you know it all so well. The 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, which concluded that much work on the Iranian program halted in 2003. If you look at the IAEA's evidence since, they've seen sporadic work, but the way it was described to me once, and this is the right panel for it, is that prior to 2003 it was their own Manhattan Project, and since then it's been a somewhat disorganized and sporadic program. Just how disorganized we don't know. In all of these things, you don't know what's going on in the university laboratories and so forth. I've been consistently surprised in my reporting on the book at how well the United States and Israel have gotten inside some of the programs, and you have seen that some with the assassinations of the scientists, which the U.S. Assures me and has assured people publicly that they are not involved in. So that leaves the Israelis as sort of the prime suspects for the sticky bomb attacks, but those attacks have been against people who are in relatively strategic places within the program. As the Israelis talked more and more about this zone of immunity, they ended up creating what the president referred to the other day as a lot of loose talk of war. And one of the interesting questions is whether or not the Israelis were having this conversation in order to prompt the United States to do more sanctions, more covert action, or whether they actually believed that the time had come. By the time Prime Minister Netanyahu was on his way here, the U.S. and Israel had had a series of very intensive conversations on this subject. Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, had taken a team over to Israel just a week or two before President Netanyahu's visit here. They had hours and hours of meetings and discussions about whether or not a zone of immunity existed or not. And here it became clear that there were sort of two distinct views, an American view and an Israeli view, based on the same set of intelligence facts. If I had to summarize it, I would say that they came down to this, that the U.S. view is that there's still time to deal with this, that even if GUM is way underground and invulnerable, and the Americans are not clear about whether it would be invulnerable to a MOP, the massive ordnance penetrator that's the U.S.'s largest weapon, but assuming for a moment that it was, that there would be plenty of other signs if the Iranians decided to race for a bomb. There would be plenty of other ways to choke off elements of the program, to choke off oil revenue. Most of the estimates are at least a year to a weapon, maybe closer to 2, depending on whether the weapon had to be fitted atop a missile. And therefore, the American view was it's been a year away in past years, and it's still a year away. The Israeli view is that's easy for you guys to say because you've got a greater capability to take it out militarily at any stage of the program, and that Israel, in its own view, did not have as much capability to take it out militarily. The U.S. lives far out of Iranian missile range. Israel's view was they live well within Israel's missile range. The U.S. believes its national intelligence estimate that the program was completely halted in 2003. The Israelis have their doubts that it was completely halted in 2003. And they're not alone. Some European countries also believe it resumed, and the British believe that it resumed. So Netanyahu came here, and we heard President Obama's speech that Jane referred to. I thought that the speech had, and his interview that ran up before that time with Jeffrey Goldberg, had one really fascinating element in it, which was that for the first time, the president declared that containment would not be a workable strategy with the Iranian program. And I wanted to sort of end on that thought here because it raises, to my mind, 2 or 3 questions that Rob and I have been kicking back and forth. First question is, did he mean it? When this president says containment is not an option, does he mean that it really is not an option and he would go to war rather than contain? Or does he mean containment the way George W. Bush meant the word tolerate when he said he would not tolerate a North Korean nuclear weapon, and then later others in his administration said they wouldn't tolerate an Iranian weapon either? Soon after the North Koreans conducted their first nuclear test, I had an interview with President Bush, and I asked him how it could be that he wasn't tolerating a North Korean nuclear weapon. And he said, of course I'm not tolerating it. We've put new sanctions on them. Well, we're now 2 tests into this. The sanctions don't appear to have considerably changed North Korean behavior. And so one of the questions here is, what does the president mean by containment? And Rob can do much better than I can the sort of Kennan view of what containment was versus what we think of it in the nuclear age. The second question was, in declaring that containment was not his policy, did the president commit himself to a military option if there is evidence that the Iranians are moving well beyond the warm the soup stage and actually are racing for a bomb? And here you get to the great uncertainty principle. It was Secretary of Defense Gates, just before he left town, asking the question, can somebody here tell me how you'll know when they're getting close? And everybody in the White House and the State Department and some at the intelligence agencies all say to me, we have great confidence we would know. They didn't persuade Gates. And I think that's just an interesting data point. And the third question is, if you are committed to a containment strategy, can you do a full containment strategy short of actually waiving the military option in a very public way? Because the catch-22 that the president is in right now is that he's trying to calm down this talk of war and has said publicly there's been too much loose talk of war and has invited the Republican candidates for the Republican nomination for president, if they were enthused about a military option, to come out and explain what the next day and week and month would look like. Or, in the alternative, is there a way through sanctions, through covert action and so forth, to accomplish the same thing you would be accomplishing through military action. And this is the point I want to end on, because I think this is really the point of big difference between the Israelis and the Americans. The Israelis say that there may be a point where military action is the last option left. The American position is, tell us why military action would buy you more of a delay than a covert action, than sanctions that were really enforced. And there's this interesting argument about whether the covert actions they have committed so far have actually bought them more delay than a military action would have. And it's one of those arguments you can't really end because you don't know what the alternative would look like. But somehow when Prime Minister Netanyahu left Washington, he left saying to the Israeli press, this is a problem that we've got some time on. It's not time that we would measure in years, but it's also not just weeks and months. So something happened in the Oval Office to persuade Prime Minister Netanyahu that, in fact, he did have a little bit more time to work this out. So I think I will end it there. And Rob, I know you had some thoughts about the containment question, so
Well, thank you, David, for that sort of excellent tour d'horizon of the issue. Let me kind of initiate the discussion by kind of not answering your three questions, but making kind of three comments. The first point pertains to the language of diplomacy. In a story that you broke for your paper some years ago, President Obama made the important distinction in terms of terminology, referring to North Korea and Iran as outliers rather than rogue states. And in this shift in language from the George W. Bush administration, he was signaling that Iran and North Korea, if they came into compliance with the norms of the system, that there was a pathway for them to reintegrate into the international system. And that's the overriding theme of the national security strategy that the Obama administration published. The fact that these regimes view the very process of integration as a threat to regime survival is really the nub of the problem in dealing with these states. But I think that just as the switch from outlier to rogue was an important distinction that was useful in terms of really creating the political space for the engagement strategy that they came to office committed to attempt. And the rap about the George W. Bush administration was, would he take yes for an answer? And with a mixed message of regime change or behavior change, it was never clear if the Bush administration would take yes for an answer. Well, after testing the proposition on engagement, the critics of the Obama administration asked, will he take no for an answer? After the Vienna deal with the Iranians fell through. And the administration, I think, put it to the test and is now mounting the international pressure on Iran to affect their decision making. The switch from containment, though, may box them in certain ways. I mean, and this is a reflection of how the term containment in the U.S. debate has become synonymous with acquiescing to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons and then deterring their nuclear weapons with our nuclear weapons. That sort of Cold War connotation. But Kennan's original kind of meaning of containment was to hold these countries in check until the internal forces could play out and there would be a kind of a mellowing of the society, as Kennan put it, or even the breakup, as he put it again in the Soviet context. And that leads to the second point, which flows from kind of this shift in language and kind of unpacking what is meant by containment. The X article, which is often cited, probably less commonly read, was not taught. The title of it, of course, was not Containment: A Strategy for Dealing with the Soviet Union After World War II. It was The Sources of Soviet Conduct. And what the genius of the X article was that, unlike his unrivaled expertise, Kennan sort of dissected how history, circumstance, ideology could come together and would lead to the kind of foreign policy that Stalin kind of laid out. And this really gets to the question of the character of the Iranian regime. And if you look at the different options that are put forward in dealing with Iran, each of these options reflects a different kind of read on the Iranian state. And the president was asked this in the interview with Jeff Goldberg: is it messianic or is it a rational actor? And he came down very much saying it's a rational actor. They care about their own survival and putting and aligning himself with that camp. Because what is driving in many quarters sort of the military kind of option is that the Iranian regime is apocalyptic and undeterrable, and therefore mere acquisition of the weapon is unacceptable. And that's sort of a view of the regime that underlies the military option. For those that advocate kind of the second and the sort of the option that we're in right now, really the sanctions and the squeeze strategy, it's the underlying assumption about the character of the regime is that it does respond to a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. That was the term that was used in the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate. The president more or less said the same in the interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, that if one applies pressure, that it can affect their calculus of decision. And the challenge in Washington, sort of, because we don't have an embassy there, is sort of getting a read on where the Iranians coming from, what is the political culture there, and how can we get some leverage on their decision-making. And then the third point, and this is really the crux of the debate between Israel and the United States, is whether the objective is to stop a weapon, and that was sort of the phraseology that the president used, and is we're not containing, we're blocking them from acquiring a weapon, versus the Israeli focus on preventing Iran from having a latent capability to develop a bomb, and in that context, how much time would different options buy you? Mohammed al-Baradei, once said you can't bomb knowledge. He talked about states that had mastered the fuel cycle as having kind of being virtual nuclear weapon states, and I think a major constraint in thinking about the military option is that it is an option that would at best sort of buy time. It wouldn't kind of end the program, and I think that between Israel and the United States. The issue that's going to just be worked through is how does one manage that tension between preventing a weapon, which is sort of the U.S. focus, versus the much more ambitious objective, particularly given the secret sites that the Iranians have had and their mastery of what Stephen Hadley called the long pole in the tent, uranium enrichment, how to prevent them from retaining an unacceptable latent, kind of capability to build a weapon. And I think that's sort of the political space that relates to where Iran is on the technological continuum. That's going to be the focus of continuing debate between Israel and the United States. So let me just put that there as sort of a conversation starter. I don't know if there's something immediately you want to respond to. I know there are people in the room. I see Avner Cohen and others who can talk about, and I'm not to put anyone on the spot, talk about the Israeli piece of it.
I think I agree with you completely, and I think the point on capability gets back to what the meaning of this term zone of immunity was, because the immunity would allow the construction of a capability. I should have made the point, we have heard from Israel similar phrases and red lines in the past. There was the point of no return a few years ago and so forth, and the Iranians made it past all of those, and I think one of the questions we have to ask is, has something changed in Israel's perception of the threat that makes this new phraseology, this new way of approaching it different from what we've seen in the past?
Jen, you want to comment?
I know there are a lot of questions, but this is fascinating. Just in terms of understanding Iran's psyche is hard enough, but Israel's psyche, I think, is pretty clear to me after spending a lot of time thinking about this and talking to them. I mean, they say that just think of the symmetry between 6 million Jews now in Israel, 6 million exterminated in World War II. It takes about 8 minutes or so by missile from some nuclear facility in Iran to hit anywhere in the landmass of Israel. So they say Iran can do in 8 minutes what it took Hitler 8 years to do. And when you kind of wrap your head around that, that is what they think, and that's how they think about this. It is different from the way we think. It doesn't mean that we don't see Iran as an active security threat. We do, and I certainly agree with that. I just want to make a point and ask David a question, put something else on the table. Our policy is a policy change, not regime change. I know that whether our administration clearly articulates that or not, that is their policy. Some in Congress would like regime change. I don't think I personally would be unhappy if there were regime change, but that's not the U.S. policy. And so one point is, if that were made clearer, would the Iranians hear us in a different way? That's one question. Secondly, David, you said they completely halted their program in 2003. I read that NIE very carefully. I was then in Congress.
I didn't say completely halted. I said they halted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But I don't think it said that. I think it said either in the public.
Suspended, I think, was
Suspended
that's
was
right.
the word.
Yes.
And nobody claimed.
The weaponization piece.
That's right. Nobody
yes.
claimed that they weren't doing ongoing research on some components which, although dual use, could be used for a bomb later. So it wasn't that clear. You agree with that? But here's my question, and this hasn't come up, and that is about the neighborhood. You were probably in Aspen when Yusuf Otaiba answered Jeff Goldberg's question, I think it was Jeff's, and said that the UAE wouldn't mind at all if steps were taken to get Iran, against Iran's nuclear program, that was an awkward moment for him, but in WikiLeaks it did come out that numbers of states are at least privately encouraging steps to be taken. So my question is, how much does this matter? What would we anticipate? Could there be a more active role by the neighborhood in stopping Iran, hopefully peacefully, and how much would this matter?
Well, Jane, first on the NIE, I agree with you completely. I should have used the word suspended. When you look at the IAEA's account in their last, I guess, 2 reports ago of the activity that's taken place that they have questions about to the Iranians, 2 or 3 of the items went on well past 2003. They're 2008 or 2009. And, of course, we're only talking about weaponization questions here. We're not discussing enrichment, which clearly has gone ahead. I heard 2 questions from you, Jane. The first one was, would they believe that the U.S. policy is not one of regime change? I would think that after Libya, they would have a hard time believing that, because the UN resolution on Libya was all about humanitarian intervention. The program very quickly became a regime change program. When I go and I ask senior members of the administration when I was interviewing them on for the Libya sections of this forthcoming book, they said, well, it became indistinguishable because the regime still posed a threat, a humanitarian threat, as long as Gaddafi was still around. The second lesson you have to think that they emerged from Libya with was probably not one that we intended when we joined the NATO effort there, which was that the Iranians must look at this and think, if Gaddafi had held on to what A.Q. Khan sold him, even if he had not completely put it into full weapons form, would NATO have been so quick about revving up the bombing campaign? And I think there are probably a fair number of people who have admitted to me privately that it would certainly have slowed the conversation down some until they had a good assessment. To your second question, essentially when that quotation came out, it was 2010 from the ambassador saying that he wouldn't mind. I had just gotten the phone call, we were months away from publishing WikiLeaks, from one of our senior editors asking me if I had a few months to go through 250,000 cables. And fortunately, I didn't have to read each and every one of them. We had a very good in-house designed computer filter for some of these. But the first thing I went looking for was exactly that. And it was from that search that I came up with the king of Saudi Arabia saying, cut off the head of the snake, and the king of Bahrain, who since had some other problems that seemed to be keeping him otherwise engaged, also suggesting that the U.S. should take action. Clearly, those states would be perfectly happy. They would probably issue a press release condemning the United States or Israel for some unilateral American or Israeli action. But it's clear from reading the cables that their upset would be well contained. I think that the bigger issue that I hear coming from the president's own statements is whether or not, if they believed Iran either was getting a bomb or had actually gotten one, how fast would there be proliferation around the region? And that's an interesting question. Certainly the Saudis have hinted that they would go for a weapon the fastest. We used to worry about the Egyptians. It strikes me right now that they're having some other organizational difficulties, and putting together a weapons program might be relatively low on their list right now. But there are other states that I think would certainly look for it.
Okay, with that, we're going to open the conversation up. Please identify yourselves and your institution. We'll start with Avner.
Yeah. Avner Cohen, the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at Monterey. I must respond immediately to what Jen has said by talking about they, the Israelis. I think what's happening in Israel in the last few months is, unlike what happened in the past, in the case of Iraq, in the case of Syria, is that Israel now is deeply, deeply divided between the people who are pro-strike in the reasonably near future and those people, including Dagan and Ashkenazi, who are hesitate and say time has come to pause. In fact, in public polls that my friend Shibli Telhami has done, we see that there is almost half, 43 versus 44, 44 against 43 with Netanyahu and Barak now. So it's Barak and Netanyahu, and the rest of the country is quite great deal of hesitation. So to talk about Israel as if it's a unitary player, it's somewhat misleading.
I was just talking about the perception of the threat,
Right, I know.
not how to handle it.
I know, but I think it is important to say that Israel today is quite divided on that issue. Factual question to David, and I have my own story, but I'm curious in your story. What do you think it was around June and then it was escalated in September, October of 2011 that led Israel to all this talk? What is your story that led to this incredible amount of talk? And the final question very quickly is, to what extent, I mean, Barak always in his interviews, for example, Charlie Rose, give various kind of public reasons why Israel is so concerned. Talk about cascade of proliferation, he talks about terrorism, and he talks about Israel constraining of freedom of action. All those reasons are quite problematic in the context of the present trajectory of Iranian action. The real reason, in my view, is Israel wants to keep its benign monopoly. The question is, and I would like for the first time to put it to an American forum, to what extent it's also an American interest to keep Israel benign monopoly, to survive and to prevail and to be protected? That's a question that hardly has been asked here. Thank you.
Avner, very good questions. First, to your first one, what changed in 2011? I think two things seem to change that I could detect, and maybe there are many more I have not. The first is that by the summer of 2011, it was pretty clear that the GUM facility, which had basically been empty from the time that the president exposed it in 2009 forward, that suddenly the Iranians were going to begin to put centrifuges in there and begin to move the 20% production, the higher enriched, or I guess what we should call it medium enriched uranium production, heavily into that facility. And so this came as a little bit of a surprise, I think, to the American intelligence community. Certainly, when we ran our first story about GUM, our first detailed one, which was the night before the president did his announcement, the president's aides, who I spoke to that evening, all said to me that they believed that once exposed, GUM would basically be abandoned. And it turned out in the end that they didn't abandon it; they just left it in hiatus for a while, and now it's going into basic production. It's also not that big; it can only hold 3,000 centrifuges. So I think that started the zone of immunity discussion. I think a second thing that happened is you'll remember that Stuxnet basically became exposed. The code went out around the world in late 2010, and I think that there was probably a fair bit of concern that whatever approach that represented may have run its course for a while, and I suspect that could also have factored into it. But I don't know for certain. It's not a conversation that people let me into.
Questions? Yes. Wait for the microphone.
Yes.
My name is Tara McKelvey, and I'm a public policy scholar and a journalist. I write for Newsweek and the Daily Beast. And I wanted to ask you about media coverage and also how we are responding to this crisis or whatever because of Iraq. To what extent does that experience color our impressions now? The Times did a really nice piece about the lead up to the Iraq War, comparing to the conversations today. And then also just, I was talking to a European diplomat, and he was saying, Tara, you guys are also paranoid because of the Iraq experience, and it makes it harder for you to understand the threat that's now in Iran.
Very good question, Tara. This is something we spend a lot of time on in the newsroom, as you can imagine. Our public editor wrote about it a week or two ago. I had a fairly lengthy conversation with him about how we sort of go about these. So here's how I would sort of break it down. The first is there are always important lessons about Iraq, and there are important lessons for the New York Times about Iraq as well. Our own coverage on that issue was, criticized for some stories that had appeared. I think when you go back and you look at the Iraq coverage, it's a little more of a complex set of stories where we had some that I think showed considerable skepticism, but those have been forgotten because of other coverage that we ran. And that certainly weighs heavily, I think, on the minds of all the reporters and editors who go and deal with that. That said, it's worth remembering that the intelligence failure that took place in Iraq was something of a unique failure, that the failures that had taken place in previous cases had mostly been failures had been failures of underestimating how far along a country had been. So, in 1949, when the Soviets had their first test, Harry Truman had a memo on his desk saying they were still, a year or two away? Is that what it said? And I suspect that Truman was probably not that happy with the quality of the intel he was receiving. There was a lot of back and forth in trying to estimate when the Chinese would test in 1964, and that was a little bit better, but not much better. They missed some of the Indian tests in the 70s. Certainly missed India and Pakistan in 1998, and that started up a commission, many of you here will remember, and that was the last mistake they had made before they went into Iraq. So if you think that all of us in life spend our time walking around trying to stop from repeating the last mistake we made, then you might understand why their bias was in the direction that it was, which does not excuse it by any means, but it just tells you that the history here is a little more complicated, that Iraq was not the first one. For the media coverage that we're doing now, we try to explain and explain again and explain a third time what the NIEs say, but we also try to explain that the dynamic here is very different. In Iraq, you had a White House that was pressing a case. Here you have a White House that is downplaying a case. In Iraq, you had the IAEA, which was expressing severe doubts. In this case, it's the IAEA that has sort of been raising the alarm, although I'm sure they have been pushed along by many of their member states, including the U.S. And Israel. So the comparison is a very easy one, but when you dig down to the next layer, many of the major players are in different places than they were in the run-up to the Iraq War.
Hang on 1 second, Paolo.
Yep, 1 second.
David, the Iranians have accepted to meet with the P5+1. What you hear from your sources in the administration, what do they expect from the Iranians? The Iranians are playing down that meeting, So what do you think, where will it go from here? Do they think that they might revive the idea of the swap again? Is it on the table or
Sure.
it's not?
Well, Hala, great to see you. And I have to tell you, when I was working on my last book and in the most desperate moments of writing, there was nobody who would come by who was more welcome as a distraction and with fabulous advice along the way. And so it's great to see you. Great to see you here. On the question of what their expectations are for this next set of negotiations, it strikes me that they're somewhere between really, really low and nearly zero. Okay, and in part that is because doing the old deal of a fuel swap, which was what was up and running in the fall of 2009, would be a lot more complex now. for those of you who may not have been following each and every turn of this now long dead deal, the essence of it was that the Iranians would ship out of the country all of the low-enriched uranium, or most of the low-enriched uranium they had, to the point where they got down to less than one bomb's worth. In other words, they couldn't further enrich the uranium that they had on hand to make a single weapon. And in return, the U.S., the Russians, the French, anybody else who was driving by would all get involved in helping provide some particularly custom fuel rods for the Tehran research reactor, which, of course, in one of those great ironies of history, the United States gave to the Iranians under the Atoms for Peace program. It shows you that nothing ever really goes away, right? To do the same thing now would require getting the Iranians to agree to ship out of the country more than 4 weapons worth. And I can't imagine, particularly in an election year, an American president could live with just shipping that to, Karg Island or someplace that left it within the country. In addition, the U.S. and its allies will all be looking for an extraordinarily intrusive inspection regime, something that would allow them to get into places like Parchin, this place where there are suspicions by the IAEA that there may have been some weapons-related testing. And it's very hard for me to imagine the Iranians giving in on that many things in the time period allowed for this kind of negotiation. And you've heard the president say that he's concerned that there would be an effort just to drag the talks on the theory that it would delay any Israeli attack.
In the back.
Bernard Hourcade from CNRS Paris and currently a scholar at Wilson Center working on Iran and politics. We have to be efficient. Nuclear issues are very important issues. And let us start from facts. The first fact is that there is no military danger today, for Israel. Iran has not a military capacity of bombing Israel or any country else. So speaking about war is not maybe the current problem. Second point, in my point of view, Iran has already the capacity to make a bomb. I don't think Iran as a regime, a current regime, the state of Iran. The state of Iran today has the capacity to enrich uranium, and even if we destroy some capacities they have here and there, the state of Iran, even if the Shah is coming back tomorrow morning, we have the capacity to enrich uranium, and this is a fact. The second fact is that Iran today has not a good capacity for weaponization. So they need more time for that. But we have to take into account the fact that Iran today, the state of Iran, has got the capacity to make a bomb within 1, 2, 300 years, I don't know exactly, as well as Germany, Japan, or many countries in the world. So the question is, of course, the short-term issue of the Islamic Republic of Iran, with the relations they have with the rest of the world, it's a question of security, international security. But it's not a matter of days, nor months, maybe 1 or 2 years. The second point is that the fact Iran as a state has the capacity to make a bomb one day or the other. So the problem is not how can we stop Iran for this capacity. Iran has got this capacity, but what is a sustainable policy to make Iran, as well as Japan or Germany, a country under control, under a sustainable control, to prevent him from making a bomb?
Well, it strikes me this gets to Rob's point about what the intent of the regime is. Obviously, Japan, where I lived for 6 years, has the fuel, it's got the scientific capability, and it has the delivery vehicles. And yet we don't hold many events at the Wilson Center worrying about the Japanese bomb. And if we did, there may be 5 people here for lunch, right? Well, lunch is free here. Let's say 15. Okay. So it really does get to what your concerns are about the regime. But you also raise another interesting point, which is a point that you hear frequently within the administration, which is even if you did the most effective bombing campaign you could imagine, all you've done is set the program back 3, 4, 5 years, who knows how many years you've set it back, but you've probably driven it further underground, and you've probably increased the resolve of the regime to ultimately build a weapon. So what have you accomplished is the fundamental question.
Right here, in the back.
Honor de Borgraf, CSIS. We now have 3 former intelligence chiefs in Israel, Mossad and Shin Bet and Army Intelligence, who retired last year. And we have 3 former CENTCOM commanders, Abu Zaid, Zinni, and Fallon. All 6 have come out against any kind of bombing of Iran, and this never gets mentioned. Why?
Why, I think it does get mentioned. I'm sure I caught Meir Dagan on 60 Minutes the other day. I've talked with all 3 of those gentlemen, and then all of the American commanders as well. The Times has run 2, 3, 4 stories, I think, about Dagan's critique. So have they been out on the front page? Probably not, but they certainly have been, we've certainly all heard their views.
Yes, go ahead.
Hussein Shabazi from Webster University. I have actually a couple of questions. One is that relates to Khalid's question. And, for the upcoming negotiations, I always wonder that why the administration and for that matter, even the media, have not seriously take up the suggestion or the proposal that Ahmadinejad mentioned in New York, and that is, he was willing to put on the table suspension or giving up the enrichment beyond 20%. Or actually, no, getting rid of the 20%, going down to that 3%. No, I have not come across that any serious journalists discuss that. And if the administration was serious about negotiation or diplomacy, why this should not be at least part of the stages of negotiation for upcoming phase. The other thing is that the other question is that from your own interviews and your own guts feeling about how the administration feels, most likely the conventional wisdom here is that this year at least there won't be any war initiated by U.S. against Iran because of the elections and all of the other considerations. Now, what would you say about after the election if Obama is re-elected? Would you say that this would create a new ball game and new rules, and Obama will not be constrained by any feeling for staging a war against Iran? Thank you.
Just to handle those briefly, to get in as many questions as we can. On the first question, I think it's what about the suggestion that we heard from Ahmadinejad that they be permitted to go up to 20%, but not beyond 20%? And I think the answer to that is I've not heard anybody in the U.S. administration, though I know they've heard this proposal, take it very seriously, and the reason they haven't is that 20% enrichment, as you know, this is on a log scale, is sort of 80% of the way to what you need for bomb grade. And that is too close, I think, certainly for the Israelis, but also for many in the U.S., particularly because the Iranians have already declared that they've already produced enough fuel for the Tehran research reactor for the next X number of years, and yet they're going to continue to produce the 20%. And that makes them wonder what that 20% is for. On your second question, which goes to the question of whether or not the administration, if I understand it right, would feel that the negotiation that they could put out, I assume what you're saying is why the administration has not put out its sort of own proposal yet. Is that where you were getting at?
No, actually, the second question was related to the possibility of.
I thought. I'm sorry. On your way there, the administration has not so far, at least in a way that I've heard, put out a serious proposal for the negotiations, although maybe they have in private. On the question of whether or not President Obama would be more likely to take military action after the election, I don't think so. I mean, my sense of the president's views on this is he does not believe that military action is the most effective way to go deal with the problem, and that is unrelated to the election. It might affect, however, the Israeli calculation, because if the Israelis act between now and the election, and I'm not saying here anything I haven't already written in the Times, they might calculate that President Obama would be under greater pressure to come in support of them prior to the election than he would be after the election.
Alex Lennon from the Washington Quarterly at CSIS. I want to, David, get back to your original question about containment and sort of thread a couple of other comments, including Rob's, about sort of the classic version of containment, and ask you if you think President Obama's statement on containment was anything other than an intention to shape the Israeli political debate on whether to strike Iran first or not. For this reason, the wonkish truth, I think, is that in media capacities, we tend to cast engagement, containment, and regime change as three mutually exclusive alternatives, and they're just frankly not. Both engagement and containment are completely consistent with regime change if you look at regime change as shades of differences among regime evolution, regime revolution, or regime toppling from the outside, and how effective regime change is if you are overtly confrontational toward a regime that you want to overturn. In other words, the administration came in with a mindset that confronting regimes that you want to overturn backfires. It's the quickest way to ensure that those regimes stay in place because you're galvanizing nationalist opposition in support of that regime that you seek to overturn in the first place. Containment is both consistent with regime change as well as engagement. If you engage through a program that seeks to get Iran entry into the World Trade Organization, that's going to be one path to regime change fairly quickly because it integrates them in ways that Rob talked about. Let me ask you, so the question is this: what would containment of Iran look like other than changing the missile defense program in ways that was done as part of the Russian reset, increasing arms sales to neighboring states around Iran in the Gulf, imposing sanctions on Iran on financial methods as part of the regime that was undergoing from the last administration, and the covert program that you outlined? Containment is in place. So was this anything other than an attempt to tamp down the Israeli rhetoric toward a preventive strike on Iran?
That's a very good question. First, I'm not sure that most people necessarily think that engagement, containment, and regime change are mutually exclusive. I mean, when you think back about the U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union, we had elements of all three. We were in constant arms control negotiations with them and other negotiations that you could call engagement. We were certainly involved in containment, and ultimately there was regime change for the reason that sort of Kennan laid out, that the internal contradictions finally caught up with them. Secondly, in the case of Iran, I don't know anybody in the administration who necessarily believes that regime change, if it happened, would solve the nuclear problem. I mean, almost everybody on all sides of the political spectrum wants to at least retain a significant nuclear program. Nobody has talked about a nuclear weapons program. On the third point that you raised, which is whether the president was just trying to shape the debate in Israel, well, I think clearly he was trying to shape the debate in Israel. But I think you may – I read his containment line a little bit differently. Certainly there is containment underway now. I think what he was trying to say was, I'm not pursuing a containment policy after they get a weapon, if it looks like they're going to get a weapon. I'm going to stop them, he seemed to say, from actually going that last stage of getting a weapon. So what he's saying is it's containment for now, but if they actually get a weapon, I've got to move beyond the containment stage. And that's the way I read his comments.
Unfortunately, we have to end. Jane Harman's opening remarks raised the expectations for this talk very high. David Sanger, I don't believe, disappointed. Please join me in thanking him.